It happens all too often. A loved one is lost, and family and friends come together to mourn. In an effort to comfort one another, advice and words of encouragement are given that are exceptionally helpful. But in opposition to this, there is advice and words of encouragement that does quite the opposite. Phrases like, just pray about it. You're so strong. They're watching over you. There's a reason for everything. Without realizing it, these are just a few of the phrases that can do the opposite of help a Christian or any individual fighting a battle with grief. Grief rarely completely goes away. Throughout every individual's life, they will have a desire or want to have the person that they lost back in their life. And that desire will kickstart the grieving process all over again. Christians must not solely focus on the psychological or the biblical methods of processing grief, but instead find a balance between the two. And once this balance is found, true and complete healing can be found. Now, to understand the full purpose of this argument, some key terms must be defined. The first is grief. Grief is a deep and poignant distress caused by, or as if by, bereavement. Bereavement is the suffering of the loss of a loved one. And balance. Balance is the state in which things occur in equal or proper amounts or have an equal and proper amount of importance. Now, the psychological methods of processing grief are activities that an individual can take place in order to maintain a sane mind. There are four main activities: to accept the finality of the loss and say the final goodbye, to take care of the family and the self, to help others in similar situations, and remember. Included in this definition are the 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross discusses. These are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, the biblical methods of processing grief directly correlate with the 5 stages of grief psychology discusses. There are 5 biblical responses: candor, which is accepting that the loss happened and finding a healthy way through it; honesty, asking for the Lord's help, receiving the Lord's help, and trusting in the Lord's plan. With all this information, there are 3 main points that must be discussed. The first is that Christians struggle on a deeper level in their grief than atheists do. The second is that the psychological and biblical methods of processing grief go hand in hand. And the third is that complicated grief and bereavement heavily affect Christians who fail to find balance. Christians must find balance in the psychological and biblical methods of processing grief. Few experiences unite and separate the Christian from the secular as much as death. And Christians struggle on a deeper level in their grief than atheists do. C.S. Lewis uses this analogy. When Christians go through the really happy time periods of their life, they feel greeted by God with open arms, and they constantly turn to Him with thanks and gratitude. They feel as if God will never abandon them and God will never let them go through the dark and depressing trials life brings. But when those trials come, it feels like God just took a metal door and slammed it in their face and double bolted it from the inside. They feel cut off from God and ask questions like, why me? What did I do wrong? Did I do something to deserve this? When it feels like God went silent, Christians are left angry and confused, wondering why does God feel so present in the good but so absent in the bad? Christians then take their anger and turn it towards God. Now, atheists lack this higher power to turn their anger towards. So instead, they focus on one of 3 goals after loss: to better themselves, to achieve a closer and better relationship with their family and friends, and to really enjoy and experience the moments they have left in the natural world. Atheists do not believe that they need a religion or a God to help them throughout the grieving process. So instead, they focus on the materialistic and natural side of things rather than the spiritual. Now, to cope with a heavy loss, psychology emphasizes the importance of healthy grieving. In healthy grief, this is where the individual looks at the loss as a whole, and instead of focusing on the torturous pain that can be felt, they attempt to find a sense of peace among it. John 16:22 says, "Now is your time to grieve, but you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." Paul Tillich, a German philosopher, emphasizes the idea that psychology and theology can blend into one another. Psychology gives individuals a multitude of ways and methods to better themselves after a loss. And the Bible gives Christians a multitude of stories of individuals who have struggled and doubted God and have gone through grief, but at the end it all glorifies God. Once it is discovered that the psychological and biblical methods of grief can go hand in hand, this is when the true healing can start. Now, the connection between the psychological and the biblical methods of grief is crucial into a Christian's grief journey. If balance is failed to be found, there are a series of negative effects that can happen. The first is prolonged grief disorder. This is characterized by a persistent and pervasive, intense yearning and longing for the individual they lost. The less serious side, there's integrated grief. This is where the loss and grief kind of affects their whole life, but it doesn't really dominate or influence it too much. This grief is normally called bittersweet. On the more serious side, there's acute grief. This happens in the early stages of loss and completely dominates and controls the individual's life. And then there's complicated grief, which has 3 subcategories: chronic grief, delayed grief, and absent grief. Christians must not solely focus on the psychological methods of processing grief, because then this is when their anger can get turned towards God, and in some extreme circumstances, they can completely walk away from God. However, Christians should not solely focus on the biblical methods either, because then they lose the ability to help their minds heal. Grief is a mentally strenuous process, and the right methods must be taken in order to find healing. Within this argument, there are other individuals who oppose the ideas that have been previously stated. Crystal Manning, a professor of religious studies at Sacred Heart University, claims that a substantial body of research has been conducted to prove that religion helps people cope with dying and gives them a hope after loss. The main factor in the statement is hope. Hope makes or breaks an individual's grieving process. Anyone who lacks hope in a greater being or a greater good is destined to struggle more than those who do not have hope. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed about those who have died, so you will not grieve like those who have no hope." The Bible describes that because of the Lord, Christians have hope in a future on this earth and a life after death. Atheists do not get to experience this hope. John Bowlby, a British developmental psychologist, claims that when a situation occurs in which we evaluate as damaging to our interests or to those we care for, our first impulse is to try to rectify the situation. After an intense loss, atheists will attempt to rectify or fix the situation in any way they can. C.S. Lewis helps prove the idea that the lack of hope that atheists possesses is more detrimental in their grieving process rather than a Christian's. In his book, A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis discusses the idea that when a Christian has a knowledge of something higher than themselves, they can bask in the hope, and that hope can help them to healing. After this, he states, "It preserves mystery, therefore room for hope." Psychology says that there is no designated right way to grieve. However, psychology also says that the 5 stages of grief must be dealt with in order to find healing. Many different psychologists have broken down what each stage can look and feel like, and this gives an idea for individuals to have a good idea of what they're going to go throughout each stage. Psychology gives some certain ideas and techniques to help individuals get through each stage, but how they decide to do it is completely up to them. The psychological methods of processing grief is the most crucial aspect to finding healing after loss. In order to heal properly from a deep and heavy loss, the individual struggling with grief needs to solely focus on the Lord and the goodness He gives all of us. To thrive in their faith, they must solely focus on God throughout their struggles, and they do not need to focus on the psychological methods of healing. God is the only healing that they need. Since they have God and only focus on Him, Christians struggle with grief, but with the faith that Christians have has helped make the pain easier. When a Christian has a faith in God and the individual that they lost also has a relationship with God, the Christian is met with an understanding of hope of eternal life. Knowing that the Christian's loved one is in a better place and no longer suffering gives them a sense of overwhelming peace. The biblical processes of grief are the sole aspect needed to find healing after loss. Now, multiple clinical trials involving grief and bereavement have been conducted. However, most of these tend to solely focus on the psychological side, but some have incorporated spiritual aspects to it. For example, one clinical trial was conducted by Jacob S. Sawyer, who is a professor of psychology at Penn State Mount Otto. This clinical trial, called Assessing Post-Traumatic Growth, Complicated Grief, and Psychological Distress in Bereaved Atheists and Believers, dove into the topic of grief and how it affects those who are believers and those who are not. 3 coping mechanisms were found to have helped believers throughout their grief process: trust and faith in God, prayer, and help and strength from God. Since these coping strategies were more personal support rather than social support, this led Sawyer to believe that atheists cope in similar ways like Christians do. Finally, one of the main takeaways from this study was that most participants felt as if the death of their loved one was a punishment by God, or God did not want to hear or answer their prayers. This clinical trial helps depict the idea that Christians struggle more in their grief than atheists do. While both sides have their own personal struggles throughout grief, the internal conflict of abandonment from God that Christians have has been proven to cause more strife in a Christian's life. While there are many positive effects of having a religion or spirituality throughout grief, there are some negative effects that some might say trump the positive. Some of these negative effects include questioning of spiritual beliefs and values. A faith weakened by loss can cause individuals to question God's character and motives. Mourners often express frustration at the lack or perceived lack of other believers in the church, and that Christians felt as if the loss of their loved one felt like abandonment from God. These In extreme circumstances, some Christians experience anxiety and additional stress as a result of religion after loss. These symptoms of anxiety and depression have diminished over time, but both bereaved and non-bereaved participants had high rates of post-traumatic stress and complicated grief. With these two effects of intense grief, the idea of religion in some circumstances to some individuals may cause more harm than good. Grief is dynamic. It changes from day to day, week to week, month to month. Elizabeth Elliot describes that what Christians are taught from the very beginning, that God is love. But when Christians are hit with a heavy loss, they can doubt the truth in that statement. Society tends to stay in the more secular realm of healing for grief by using the methods of psychology that have been previously stated. But Christians must understand and learn how to integrate biblical responses into the psychological methods of healing. Grief is inevitable, but once finding helpful processes in both methods of grief can benefit not only the Christians, but anyone else who struggles with grief. Throughout these stages of grief, biblical integration needs to be added into each stage of grief that psychology discusses. Author Robert W. Kellman does this perfectly. He put a biblical response into each stage of grief to help Christians find a healthy way of healing, of balancing both the psychological and biblical methods of grief. Grief is as just unique as the individual experiencing it. Grief and loss touch the lives of every single person on this earth at some point in their life. And one of society's hardest challenges is finding a way to get through grief. Being a Christian does not shield someone from the pain and loss, the pain that you can feel after a loss. It is not wrong to grieve. It is not a sign of spiritual weakness or failure. But Christians must find balance in the psychological and biblical methods of processing grief. For the past 3.5 years, I have worked to find balance in the psychological and biblical methods of processing grief. I lost my mom to stage 3 ovarian cancer my freshman year of high school. My mom was my best friend. She was there for everything. School event, sporting event, you name it, she was there. She was brilliant, kind, loving, selfless, beautiful, independent, I could go on. She was the definition of what a mom should be. I know that the pain of grief will never completely go away, but I'm learning how to find balance, and it gets better almost every day. I know that balance isn't an easy thing to discover, but once it is, the pain of grief slowly starts to go away. Thank you.